Hello everyone, I'm really happy to welcome you this morning. I'm Sophie Duval, Chief Operation Officer at Gireve. Our topic today is price transparency for EV charging in roaming situations. I will drive you through a couple of slides for about 30 minutes. During this presentation, you can write your questions down in the chat bar. Marie, who is in charge of communications at Gireve and who organized this webinar, will pick up your questions, and then we will have a Q&A sessions for about 15 to 20 minutes. I will kindly ask you to switch your microphone off during the presentation and raise your hand if you want to speak during the Q&A session. First, we will redefine the concept of EV charging pricing, especially in roaming situations. Then we will speak about the diversity of stakeholders and challenges for tariff and tariff structures. Finally, we will use the example of the Dutch regulation on price transparency to see the requirements all along the chain of EV charging in roaming situations and how Gireve can help. There are usually three ways for an EV driver to access and pay on a charging point. The first one is called direct payment, sometimes also called ad hoc payment, and it allows driver to charge without any subscription. In some situations, CPO is also a service provider and allows his local clients to subscribe to a charging service on his network. This you can see, for example, in large cities. Third situation is when the CPO decides to open his network to roaming. I suppose that most of you know this roaming concept, but for those who are not familiar with it, I will quickly explain. Roaming is not new. It already has been existing for many years in several industries. With your French Orange mobile subscription, you can use your phone everywhere in the world. You can withdraw cash with your Barclays card from an HSBC ATM. Same for railways or tolls on highways. For EV charging, e-mobility service providers allow their EV driver clients to charge on thousands of charging stations operated by different CPOs. Sometimes they don't own any charging stations themselves. In order to do that, EMSPs have to conclude agreements with all those CPOs and also set up a technical connection with each of them. In roaming situation, the end-user tariff depends on several stakeholders, and it is interesting to understand the components of those tariffs and how they are set. First, the CPO. It has to include the amortization of its charging points, is infrastructure maintenance, it has IT cost, it has to provide some help desk, and it will include its markup. EMSPs, they have to manage hundreds of thousands of customers, soon millions of customers, so they have to include their subscriber management, invoicing, help desk, support. They have also IT cost, and they will include their markup. Finally, the ability for roaming is generating specific costs. Those costs are contract-related, contractual settings, service level agreement. They have to agree on B2B prices. There are some tax issues. There is some IT setting, of course, and they have also to share static data for providing the description of the charging infrastructure to the MSP. They have to exchange real-time data, and they have to monitor this real-time data flow. Also, they have to manage sometimes some incident, and because there is a contractual relationship, there is a need for billing, invoicing, and payment between the two parties. Those roaming costs can be split in two ways. Only between the CPO and the EMSP, in case these two operators are connected directly. It is what we call the peer-to-peer connection. Or those costs can be split through a roaming platform such as Gireve, which mission is to industrialize technical, legal, and financial services related to roaming, and also to share those services with hundreds of operators. Operators can benefit from the economy of scale made by the platform and reduce drastically their internal costs. In this second part, we will discuss this notion of diversity of stakeholders and the challenges on tariff structures. About the diversity of stakeholders, this is a snapshot of Gireve today. We have nearly 450 charging point operators connected to Gireve, which represents 110,000 charging points in Europe today. Nearly 100 EMSPs are also connected to Gireve, and they have already signed more than 3,300 roaming agreements on our marketplace. This allows around 1 million EV drivers to use roaming charging services via Gireve. This is the list of e-mobility service providers connected to Gireve and using Gireve services. They can sometimes also be a CPO, or they can be pure player, meaning that they don't own any charging infrastructure themselves. Most of the main car manufacturers are using Gireve services either directly or indirectly via some EMSP aggregators. Let's come back to our tariff topic. 450 different CPO networks are currently proposing more than 500 B2B tariffs to EMSPs on Gireve's marketplace. We can see here that roughly 2/3 of those tariff structures are rather simple. They can be based only on duration, or only on energy, or only on session. But 1/3 are still complex and diverse. They may combine several of those components. They may depend on time slots or power range. They may include parking fees, etc. If we take the EMSP side, who wants to offer the largest possible charging point coverage, it is rather normal to have more than 200 roaming agreements. This EMSP has to face and manage this tariff diversity. It has several challenges to face. It must know at any time what its B2B cost is for each single charging point. These tariffs can change sometimes very often. It has to set up its B2C price. It can do that in different ways. First way, simplification. One unique tariff, whatever the charging point is. Then its challenge is to control its margin. It can also align its B2C tariff structure on the CPO one. Its markup then can be a percentage or a fixed fee. The final user, his main requirement is simplicity and transparency. In this next chapter, we will go through the Dutch transparency regulation. First, to illustrate the challenges for CPOs and EMSPs, and also to describe how some of the Gireve services can help them to be compliant. What is the price transparency regulation in the Netherlands? First, actually, it is the application of the consumer law to EV charging services. For ad hoc charging, the CPO must be compliant. In roaming situation, the EMSP must be compliant. The scope of the regulation is for any EV driver charging in the Netherlands, either via ad hoc payment or through an EMSP subscription. Any Dutch EV driver subscriber to a Dutch EMSP and traveling everywhere in Europe. And also any CPO operating in the Netherlands. even if it doesn't have any legal registration in the Netherlands. We are talking about a Dutch regulation here, but it is important to know that consumer regulation applies everywhere in Europe. It is currently focused on consumers, but will probably apply to business clients soon. Enforcement can lead in the Netherlands to up to 900,000 euros penalty or 10% of the turnover. This is not small money. We will go through the main requirements of the Dutch transparency regulation, following each step of the customer charging experience. First step, before charging session. Regulation says EV driver must know the applicable tariff of the charging point before starting a charging session. The requirements are for the MSP to be able to display its B2C tariff to EV driver on its mobile app or on its website. This also implies that he knows his B2B tariff from the CPO. 3 services are proposed by Gireve to help operators to comply. First, our marketplace. EMSPs can browse all CPO roaming offers and sign roaming agreements online. B2B tariffs are included in the roaming agreement and are legally binding. We also have an online paperless workflow to manage tariff changes with legal amendments. Second service, static data API. This is the description of all charging point details, and it includes each tariff which applies to each charging point. For operators connected to Gireve in OCPI, we also support the tariff module, which allows CPOs to exchange tariff description real-time with the MSPs. Second step, during charging session. Regulation says EV driver must be able to follow up his consumption at any time during the charge, so he can decide to stop or continue his session. The requirements are for the EMSP to be able to display consumption details real-time. As the service is technically delivered by the CPO must be able to send this information real-time, and the MSP must be able to process it. 3 services are proposed by Gireve. The first one is real-time session information. It's also called sometimes intermediate call detail record, CDR. For example, every 5 minutes, which includes meters such as energy consumed since the beginning of the charge. Gireve has an added value service here to check all these CDRs real time, check if there are inconsistent data, and create alerts to operators. Gireve can also calculate the B2B price on the fly based on the tariff which has been defined in the roaming agreement between the 2 parties. The ability of the CPO to send session information real time is fully part of the CPO offer and the roaming agreement, and it's legally binding. The EMSP can select its CPO partners with full knowledge regarding this capability. Next step, immediately after the charging session. Regulation says EV driver must be informed of the total cost and consumption details immediately after the charge. The requirements are for the MSP to be able to display the final cost and all consumption details just after the charge. As the service, once again, is technically delivered by the CPO must be able to send this information after the charge, and the MSP must be able to process it. The 3 services proposed by Gireve are exactly the same, as the ones described previously. Only the intermediate CDRs have to be replaced by final CDRs. Last step of the customer experience is when he receives his invoice. Regulation says EV driver must be able to verify the cost of each charging session on his invoice. The requirements are for the MSP to be able to provide an invoice in due time and with detailed information, allowing EV driver to check the cost calculation. CPO must provide a B2B invoice with detailed information for each session. Two services here proposed by Gireve. First, Gireve stores all CDR and become the official repository in case of disagreement between parties. Gireve also has a dedicated service for CPOs to prepare and issue the B2B invoices to EMSP on behalf of the CPO with detailed information for each session. In some cases, Gireve can also collect payments on behalf of the CPO. Finally, let's wrap up the range of services proposed by Gireve to facilitate price transparency for both CPO and EMSPs. This is the list here of these services proposed by Gireve for operators connected with standard OCPI protocol or with our Gireve protocol called EMIP. They can be based on APIs such as Tariff ID for each EVSE in the location data or real-time CDRs. They can be based on algorithms to check CDR compliance or to calculate the B2B price. They can be based on marketplace website for EMSPs to check legally binding CPO capabilities to support price transparency. Finally, they can be business process outsourcing for B2B invoicing and payment collection. This presentation is finished. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can move on to the Q&A session.